This is Liz Avore. Liz is a senior policy advisor for Voting Rights Center. She is a lawyer. She for every town, and so established the Policy Center for basically the largest gun safety group in the country. And in terms of voting rights, she's an expert, a nationally quoted expert on access, as well as other aspects of election law. So please join me today in welcoming Liz Avore.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, my name is Liz. I am the Senior Policy Advisor over at Voting Rights Lab, and I'm really thrilled to be able to talk to you guys today, and happy to do a little demo of the tracker that we have that kind of tracks elections legislation as it's introduced and as it moves through the process in the 50 states. Also tracks existing law across the country as well as it relates to voting and elections. And then I'll also kind of take folks through a little tour of like what we have noted over the past several years in terms of election trends and what we are seeing so far this year and are kind of looking at in terms of trends and election policies in the states. So I will start by just sharing my screen here so I can show you the tracker. So what we have here is our Voting Rights Lab tracker, and you can see this is our homepage for it. It's at tracker.votingrightslab.org. And in terms of what it does is it tracks legislation related to elections that as it's introduced across the 50 states and as it moves, and it tracks existing laws as well and kind of updates in real time what the existing law is on various election policies across the country. We don't track litigation on it, although if litigation changes existing law, that is reflected on our surveys. And we don't track federal legislation on here, just in terms of what it doesn't do. So here to start with, our bill search function, if you click on that here, this is kind of what our site is probably used most for is following legislation as it's introduced across the country and kind of seeing what's moving and getting an understanding of state legislation that relates to elections that's been introduced and moved across the country in the states. It's, as folks who have tried to cover state legislation on anything know, there is a lot happening across the country at any given time during the state legislative session, and it can be a kind of opaque process that's hard to follow. So our goal here is to make it a little bit more transparent for people who are trying to follow what's going on. So we can see here that so far this session, there are 48 states have introduced elections-related legislation so far, a total of 1,423 bills. And one of the updates that we've made to our site recently is we have this column here called recent action, and it automatically sorts everything by the last date that something happened to the bill, basically. So it's kind of cool because it allows you to see what's moving. So it moves everything that's moving to the top of the sort. So we can see here that we've had this bill in Minnesota was introduced today, and we can also see, some bills were pre-filed in Florida on Friday, and that's because, in Florida, the legislative session doesn't start until later this week. And so it's kind of, it's a nice feature that you can kind of see what is happening in real time right now, but it might be that you're looking at that and you're like, well, I don't really care if a bill is just introduced. I'm more interested in what's actually moving. And one of the things you can do to pull that up is to use our latest stage sort here, which you can see. This is the latest stage that a bill has reached. So let's say we just want to pull everything that's made it at least past its first chamber committee, so the first committee. And so I'm pulling up everything that has moved past that point. Since this is the latest stage, I need to click each one of these in order to, pull up everything that has at least passed the first committee, but I want to also include things that have made it further along the legislative process. So now I'm just pulling up those bills that have been moving this session. And now you can see I'm still sorting by recent action. So I can see, kind of like what happened on Friday, basically across the country when it comes to elections legislation. You can see that this bill in Minnesota was enacted. If I want to know more about that, I can click on it. And each bill that we analyze has a card like this. Gives you a few facts about the bill, who the author was, what has most recently happened with it, whether it improves or restricts voter access and election administration, what its current location is, when it was introduced, when it was last amended. And then also include the summary here. So I can see that this is the bill in Minnesota that restores voting rights to people with past felony convictions after they've been released from prison. And if I want to look at the actual bill, I can click read bill text, and it actually takes me to the bill text there. I can also see these are the different tags that we give the bills. So you can kind of just learn a little bit more about the impact of the bill, but it's really the kind of the summary, the plain English summary that's going to give you a good idea of what that bill did. And I can look through and also see other things that happened so far on Friday, basically where legislation failed, where it passed a chamber or a committee. So that's one way to kind of like look at what's moving around the country. If I'm interested in kind of looking at that, if I was like, oh, I actually have been hearing a lot, about voting restoration bills like that this session, and I'm curious about where else they've been introduced. I can also search by issue area. So I can pull up, these are all our issue areas. We track voter registration, mail voting, in-person voting, ID requirements, proof of citizenship. And then I've got down here to voting in the criminal justice system. And if I'm less interested in disenfranchisement and rights restoration for people with past felony convictions, I can just click here. And now I can see the number of bills that have been introduced this session that deal with voting restoration. But again, if I'm only interested in bills that are moving, again, I can pull up here. I can say, I just want to pull up the bills that have been enacted. It's just that Minnesota bill. If I want to include bills that have passed 2 chambers, I can click there and kind of go through. And if I say I want to pull all the bills that have passed at least 1 chamber, and I can see where else that's happened so far this session, where bills that relate to, in this case, voting restoration, voting rights for people with past felony convictions, I can see where the movement has been. And click on any of these bills to get more information about that specific bill in that state. Another new feature actually for our tracker is that we can also look back at previous years. So if I'm interested in, for example, all the states that are looking to restrict mail voting, for example, in the past 3 years. So this database goes back to 2021. So I'm saying, so since the 2020 election, I want to see where states have been working to restrict mail voting. I can click all 3 years there. And then I go to my issue areas and I'm interested in mail voting. So I'm going to click all of the sub issues here that have to do with mail voting. And then I'm interested in restricting mail voting. Oh, sorry. So I can go ahead and I want the bill impact to be about restricting mail voting here. I can pull this up, and now I'm seeing all the bills that restrict voter access by around mail voting. And so if that might not be a particularly, these are all bills that were introduced. And so that's not really telling us too much, because obviously anybody can introduce a bill. So it might be that we're like only interested in the bills that were enacted over the past several years. And then we get the smaller universe of bills that were enacted. And if I'm looking, let's say I want to do a specific area of mail voting, for example, and I just want to look at, let's say I want to look at all the bills where the legislature was prohibiting election officials from proactively mailing mail ballot applications. That's a thing we've seen a lot of states do. So the laws make it illegal to prohibit election officials, at least from mailing applications to people unless they specifically request them. And click on that sub issue there. And now I'm pulling up just the 5 states that have done that. We actually don't need that tag in that case, but yeah, so just the 5 states that have done that. And the bills that have done it. So we can search through our bill database using all of the, just looking at stuff that happened this year, or we can look just at stuff that has happened historically as well in 2022 and 2021. So that's our bill search function. I guess that I should say you can also search by, just a specific state if you're just kind of interested in stuff that is happening in Texas, for example. We can just pull up the Texas bills. And again, we can see the number of bills that have been introduced. And if we're interested in those that are more moving, we can also sort by latest stage here. Texas has pretty recently come into session, so there's just the one bill that has passed a committee so far. But we can see the bills have been introduced there. You can also pull up a specific bill number if you want to type it in there. And that is how our bill search function works. We also have, that's obviously, this is a very comprehensive database that has a lot of information in it. If you're looking to kind of just get a lay of the land in terms of what is happening this session, we have these session snapshots that you can use. So here, I clicked on voter access under session snapshots, and we can look and see where legislation is moving, it was advancing in specific issue areas across the country. So here, this first section is about expanding voter access. You can see we track we include on here a number of different issue areas around expanding mail voting, around expanding early voting, voter registration, and voting in the criminal justice system. And I can look on the top, we're tracking how the legislation is moving across through the legislature. So these are the introduced column. They've got past first chamber, past second chamber, enacted. And then these last 3 columns are actually all versions of failed. Either it failed in the legislature, it was vetoed, or the relevant provisions were actually removed from the legislation. So even if the legislation advanced, it no longer includes the relevant provision that we're tracking. So I can look through here and see, we're relatively early in session right now, but I can see that it looks like there's a fair bit of momentum around ballot drop boxes. And I can see that there are bills for these 4 states introduced bills, and then there's in 4 states the bill has advanced to the point where it's passed the first chamber. And if I click on ballot drop-off sites, I can see some more detail about what the states were that did that. And so I'm interested in these states, seeing that Kansas, New Jersey, New Mexico, and New York all have a bill that passed the first chamber that expands access to ballot drop boxes. If I want to get more detail, I can click on one of them and see in Kansas, this is the bill that passed that passed the first chamber. And I can see this is the provision that has to do with drop boxes. You can see that basically this bill looks like it is expressly allowing for drop boxes, which are not expressly provided for in existing code. Although in 2020 the state did provide them, so I can see what exactly the bill does. Rolling through, I can see it looks like expanding early voting is another area where we've got some progress being made, and can take a look at the states that are doing that. And voting restoration is another area where I can see, oh, there's some movement here. Let's see, Minnesota's, that's the Minnesota bill that was enacted that we saw earlier. And these are states that all have a bill that would restore rights to people with past felony convictions. That has a bill has passed the first chamber in these 3 states. We also have this section here around restricting voter access. This is the same idea. We can see the attacks on drop boxes are also there's also some movement around that. So drop boxes are a popular topic still, both for restricting access and increasing access to them. And we can see, there's that bill, the one bill in Ohio that passed, a bill in South Dakota that passed 2 chambers, and these 4 states passed legislation that passed 1 chamber around drop boxes. Scrolling through, I can see that though a lot of states introduced legislation that restricted eligibility for mail voting. None of that legislation has actually moved, but we do see quite a bit of movement here around legislation that imposes a stricter requirement for voters who are looking to cast a mail ballot. So you can see that could include like a notary or witness signature, or requiring an ID number, but just requiring additional verification requirements. We see quite a bit of movement here in that area. And so you can kind of scroll through and just see where there is movement. We have a similar snapshot for interference with election administration, which is different than voter access in that it's not necessarily about access to casting a ballot, but this is more about legislation that interferes with the nonpartisan administration of elections itself. And this is something that we added to our tracker when we saw it getting a lot of traction after the 2020 election. We saw states introducing this type of legislation, so we wanted to track it separately. And there's a lot less, I will say, this year than we have seen in the previous 2 years. But you can still see that there are a number of bills that are moving. Penalizing election officials is an area where we're definitely still seeing some movement in legislation. So those are our session snapshots, and they are updated in real time as bills move through the session. So we'll continue to see a ton of changes to those grids there. Let's see, I'll take us back to our homepage here. So you can see that was the bill certs and the session snapshots. We can also go to the issues that we're tracking here. And this will take you to our current existing law surveys of different policy areas. So for example, if we are interested in mail voting and want to know how different states treat mail voting eligibility, we can go here and we see a map. And because sometimes our color scheme looks a little bit close, you can also just click on any of these and they say, let's see, in 8 states, all voters automatically receive mail ballots for each election. We click here and we can see what those 8 states are. There are 27 states that have no excuse mail voting. You can see those. And then there are the 15 states that require an excuse to vote by mail. We can see what those are. So we have these various maps that will give you a summary of what the existing law is across the states. Let's go back here. We've also, I guess we can also look at, sub areas such as if we're interested in returning mail ballots, for example. We have all of these different maps that you can look at. You can look at, the requirements for submitting a mail ballot. We were just talking about that, where in 34 states, basic identifying information is sufficient to cast a mail ballot. And in 16 states, we're saying there are additional hurdles for casting a mail ballot. That's pretty vague. So if you're interested in what the requirements actually are, you can click on a state. It'll take you to that state's the summary of the law as it relates to that question. So you can see that in Missouri, absentee ballot envelopes have to be witnessed or by an elected authority or a notary public and signed there. And so that's when we're talking about an additional hurdle, that's what that hurdle is. You can also see which states have a notice and cure process. You just click on any of these kind of side maps and you'll get like a map of whatever the detail is that you're looking at. And so we have these across all of these issue areas here. You can see, you can click on any of these issue areas and get the maps of existing law as it relates to them. You can also search for existing law by state, which is another way to look at it. If you're interested in Ohio's law, you can click on Ohio. We have a little brief summary at first that kind of tells you some basic facts about Ohio law and also puts the law in context nationally. As you can see, it offers in-person early voting, for example. Tell you that 46 states and DC offer early voting, and 25 offer weekend voting, which is what happens in Ohio. So you can see that we just kind of have a summary of the law there. You can also dive in, get more detail about any of the policies that we track. If you're interested in its ID law, for example, you can click on the ID requirements and kind of scroll through, and we answer all of these specific questions about the Ohio's ID law in this case. We can also, you can get that same information about voter registration, for example, and learn about the registration deadlines and how folks and who can register to vote in Ohio. So that's our existing law surveys. We also have a section of the website that is devoted to our analysis. We have three main types of analysis that we do. On top of that, we use basically we have three types of analysis that we do to make all the data that is in this database a little bit more accessible. One is that we have a weekly newsletter called The Markup, and you can subscribe for that and get it in your inbox every Monday. This is what it looks like. We have an archive here on our website of it, but you'll get this in your inbox. It's actually a little bit more reader friendly in email form, but we have a summary of kind of the restrictive legislation that has moved this last week, the expansive legislation that's moved, and then we have a looking ahead section that tells you what we have our eye on coming up, the hearings that we know about, the things that we're watching to see, that we expect to see happen this week. And then we have a detailed, well, not too detailed, a little blurb about each of these, the different things that we told you that happened in the past week that summarize this legislation. We're generally talking about legislation that has passed the chamber or has been enacted, but that the markup kind of just summarizes what we're paying attention to in the past week. We also have a monthly newsletter that is called The Lever that includes a monthly hot policy take, is what we call it. But it's just basically a deep dive into something interesting that is happening. This was our one from January. That was about the Ohio voter ID law, and we were just getting a lot of questions about how it differed from other state ID laws. So we did a little blurb on how it varied, how it differed from other state ID laws, and showed that the 10 other states that kind of have ID laws that are similar to Ohio's, and just kind of put the law in national context. And then we also do 4 times a year, we issue reports that give a summary of sort of like just what's happening nationally. This was one that was this report kind of did a summary of everything or the trends that we had seen emerge in 2021 to 2022 and like what we were expecting to happen in 2023. This was our December report last year. And just kind of shows you, it's a PDF that kind of take you through some of the trends that we have that we've noted. So this particular report was spanned several years, but we'll be putting one out later this month that will show some trend analysis on kind of which types, what is happening with the different popular voter policies over the past year and like how this year's introduction rate and movement rate is stacking up over to the past couple of years. So that kind of trend analysis is what we do in those reports. So that is our tracker. I don't know if it makes sense. Why don't I hold for questions until to the end here? But I'm going to now take us through just a little so a deck that I put together that will just kind of show us some of the trends that we've noticed in the past couple of years. So first I'll talk a bit about just generally taking a big step back in terms of voter access legislation. Generally, we've seen, states really kind of trending in different directions in the past since the November 2020 election, where we see, the states in blue here have mostly improved access for voters, and the states in red have mostly restricted access. And then you can see the ones in light gray passed legislation that had a mixed impact on voter access. For example, in Kentucky, the state passed legislation creating in-person early voting for the first time, but the state also allowed for the consolidation of polling places that actually resulted in consolidating, eliminating enough polling places that there were longer lines than Kentucky has seen in the past, this past election in 2022. So the state did a great thing, and it expanded voter access in one dimension and it restricted in the other. So that's why it's categorized as mixed. And so each of the mixed states has a story like that, where the legislature expanded access along some dimensions and restricted it along others. And then the ones, the dark gray ones here, those are the states that didn't take any made major changes to voter access in the past couple of years. And so you can see that here, when we're looking at a national map, we can see that actually more states have expanded access than have restricted access. But but the country certainly has been divided over the past couple of years in terms of the direction that the legislatures are taking voting access. Okay, so the next map here is about election interference. So this is a new category, as I mentioned, that kind of emerged after starting in 2021. After the November 2020 election, we saw states introducing legislation that was really designed more to interfere with the administration of elections and wasn't so much related to voter access specifically. And so we created, just a new way of tracking that type of legislation. And you can see that actually most states have enacted some type of legislation like that in the past couple years. And this really spans a pretty wide variety of different policy areas. So, this includes legislation that would, for example, give more state legislative control over determining election results. It includes legislation that criminalizes election officials for behavior that was previously that was previously legal, such as, for example, mailing mail ballot applications to folks who haven't requested them. This type of legislation would also include partisan audits. All states, or not all states, but most states do have some kind of auditing process. We aren't including all auditing bills in this category, but we would include bills that include reviews of election results that are partisan in nature, or that are conducted by a body that doesn't traditionally have any election expertise or that sort of thing. We're including these new types of election review bills that we're seeing that are more partisan based. And so this is election interference. It's a one thing that we've noted about it in terms of its trend line is that kind of started in 2021. It grew very quickly throughout 2022. And we saw a lot more legislation around election interference in 2022. And now it's kind of on the decline and seems to be more on 2021 levels. And so it kind of remains to be seen whether it continues to dip back down or stays steady. But we definitely, it seems like we've hit our peak on this type of legislation. Okay, so mail voting is a policy area where we have seen a big divide in the country. It's become in the past couple of years, it's definitely become more partisan than it was previously. And you see that while there are nearly half the country actually improved mail voting in the past couple of years, there's still a lot of states that restricted mail voting since 2021. And this is definitely just one of those areas where we are seeing that narrative of the kind of the country being divided play out. Although within this area, there are some policies that we see a lot of agreement on. For example, we've seen a lot of states across the political spectrum creating processes that make sure that voters are notified if there are errors on their absentee ballot envelopes, and given a chance to correct those errors, sometimes referred to as a notice and cure process for mail voting. We've seen a lot of states make progress on that. We're seeing a lot of states introduce and pass ballot tracking legislation and giving election officials more time to process mail ballots. So there are some areas where we're definitely seeing more agreement on, but then there are areas like drop boxes where we're seeing just the country really headed in different directions on mail voting. In terms of in-person early voting, so casting a ballot early but in person, we've seen really remarkable progress over the past couple of years on this issue. There are only 4 states left that don't offer any form of in-person early voting. And one of them, Connecticut, is actually poised to create early voting this year. And we've just, again, this has been one of those issues that has really not been partisan at all. We've seen a tremendous amount of progress in states across the political spectrum, including states like Missouri and South Carolina creating 2 weeks of early voting for the first time. So we're just this is an area where it's not completely uniform, but we have seen large agreement across the country on in-person early voting and the changes that states have made. So the criminalization of elections is a type of election, and we categorize as a type of election interference legislation that we're talking about states that are either creating kind of election crimes units that are focused on investigating, solely focused on investigating election crimes, particularly against election officials. We're also talking about just states that are increasing the penalties for election crimes or creating new election crimes largely. And this, as you can see, that there are, over the past couple of years, we've seen quite a few states that have enacted legislation that increases the criminalization of elections. And let's see. So in terms of 2023, so those maps that I just took us through were really kind of like the trends that we've noted in the past 2 years, in 2021 and 2022. And some of those trends are continuing. And we're also seeing new trends emerge this year. In 2023, it does seem like we're kind of hitting a point where we're 2 years out from the 2020 election and just seeing kind of new trends develop right now. One is around voting restoration. We kind of saw that on the election law snapshots that we're looking at earlier, where we're seeing a lot of states introduce and move legislation that would restore voting rights to people with past felony convictions. Minnesota just enacted that law on Friday. We're also seeing legislation around this moving in Nebraska and Missouri. And it just seems to be a policy that has some traction this year, and that we have our eye on that. It was a policy that was moving Also, prior to the 2020 election, and 2018 and 2019, we were seeing states enact this type of legislation, and then I think it took a bit of a hiatus while folks were really focused on legislation around mail voting and early voting and election interference over these past couple of years. But we're now seeing states turn back to voting restoration. We have online voter registration is another policy area where we're seeing some movement where this just basically allows voters to register to vote online. I'm seeing it move in states like Texas and North New Hampshire. So it seems like that is an area around just election modernization that has some traction around it this year in 2023. We're also seeing states enact protections for election officials. In some places, we're seeing them create confidentiality requirements that basically just ensure that election officials, their personal information is confidential. And this is in response to the fact that a lot of election officials have been receiving threats from members of the public. And this one of the top things that we've heard election officials asking for is just that kind of confidentiality protections. We've also seen states introducing legislation that makes it clear that it's a crime to threaten or harass election officials, and to provide them protection that way. We're also seeing legislation providing better access for voters with disabilities, and this is a trend that we've actually seen over the past couple of years, where states have been passing legislation that creates more language access and vision access and just better access for voters who require additional help in order to cast a ballot. And finally, mail ballot tracking and cure, which I talked about earlier, is an issue area that we're still seeing a lot of states move on. In terms of restrictive policies, we have seen the criminalization of elections is continuing this year. We definitely are seeing more of that type of legislation. There is in Texas, the Texas session has really just begun, and the introduction deadline is the end of this week. So I think we're expecting to see a lot more bills introduced even this week in Texas. But it seems to be a big focus of the Texas legislature this session. They're only in session every other year, and for a pretty short time. So there tends to be a lot of activity during those periods. In fact, actually in 2021, Texas bills made up about 20% of the total number of bills in our tracker. So there tends to be very prolific during their every other year sessions, and we are hearing and seeing a lot of legislation, that would, create dedicated law enforcement officers to prosecute election crimes. Seeing legislation that would increase the penalties for various election crimes, and that would give the Attorney General more authority to prosecute election crimes when the local when the local prosecutors aren't. So we definitely are just seeing like a lot of conversation there and a lot of legislation there around the criminalization of elections. Voter ID is another policy area that is getting a lot of traction this year, particularly student ID. We're seeing states, Ohio just removed student ID from the types of ID that are acceptable as voter ID in the state, and Idaho is moving a bill that I think the Senate was actually voting on it today, that would ban student ID as a form of voter ID. So we're just seeing a lot of movement around that in a way that we actually more than we have in recent years. And then the restrictions on mail ballot verification. We talked a little bit about that earlier, but that's something that over the past several years, we've seen a lot of momentum around making it more difficult to get an absentee ballot, or to either receive or cast an absentee ballot, in terms of the information that is required to do so. And that's something that we're continuing to see this year. And 2023 trends, in terms of the ones that are mixed, mail voting still continues to be kind of divisive, and especially drop boxes. We're seeing a lot of drop box legislation still that both expanding access and restricting access to it. As I said, we don't track litigation kind of on our tracker, but we do often have our eye on it because we need to know when laws change in order to update our surveys. Uh, and I'm just kind of highlighting here a few of the things that we are watching right now. I'm sure folks are familiar with Moore v. Harper, the case that's before the U.S. Supreme Court, and this Supreme Court just recently asked the parties to weigh in on whether the case would become moot if the North Carolina case from which it sprung is decided. And to kind of jump to that, I should talk about North Carolina. So the state Supreme Court in North Carolina, following the 2022 elections, it has a new configuration, and that Supreme Court in North Carolina has agreed to rehear two cases that were just decided by the previous North Carolina Supreme Court a few months ago. One is around voter ID and one is around redistricting. The redistricting case is about North Carolina's redistricting maps, which were found to be partisan by the North Carolina Supreme Court, and that those maps also gave rise to the Moore v. Harper Supreme Court case that's before the U.S. Supreme Court right now. So because North Carolina Supreme Court is going to rehear that redistricting case, it might be that that the U.S. Supreme Court case becomes moot as a result. Although it seems like the Supreme Court is weighing that question right now about whether it should still decide that case following the North Carolina Supreme Court's decision. The North Carolina Supreme Court is also rehearing a voter ID case that it decided last year. North Carolina's the court had previously said that North Carolina's voter ID law was racially discriminatory and unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court, the new Supreme Court, is rehearing that case and may come to a different conclusion. It's a bit unusual for it to be rehearing cases for which there are not new facts and that were just decided a couple of years ago, or a couple of months ago. So it's getting a fair bit of national attention, these rehearings in North Carolina, but they are set to potentially kind of change the law in that state. And then, of course, the Wisconsin Supreme Court elections are this year, and Wisconsin is actually a great example of a state where you can really kind of see how litigation creates law. Over the past year, there were no new election laws that were enacted in Wisconsin, but there were significant changes to the way voters experienced their election in 2022 as compared to 2020, because the Supreme Court there had to determine that several practices that the Wisconsin Election Commission had in place were actually in violation of state law. So there were, in particular around vote by mail, there are several ways that vote by mail became more difficult in Wisconsin as a result of some determinations by the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Because the court has been so active there, the Supreme Court elections are meaningful, are getting some national attention, I should say, and in Wisconsin. So I actually kind of already talked about these, but I'll just real quickly talk again about we have basically 3 types of analysis. This is the markup, which I talked about, which is the weekly newsletter you can get that will just give you a quick summary of what happened last week, we're thinking is going to happen this week. And this is not the full markup that you're seeing here, but this is kind of like the brief summary section at the beginning. Our monthly newsletter is the lever, and that includes within it a just kind of a deep dive into a particular policy area that we think is interesting or getting a lot of attention, and that we will try to put in some national context. And finally, our reports, which I mentioned, we issue 4 times a year, and are often trying to do year-over-year comparisons with them, and also just to kind of give a snapshot summary of where we are in session during them as well. this you can kind of see here in this this image that this was from last year. This was the report that we issued in July of 2022, and we were kind of showing that election interference legislation was on the rise in terms of how much was being introduced. And this year, as a sneak preview, we're definitely seeing it fall again. So it seems like 2022 was the peak when it comes to election interference legislation. And so that's it. I can stop talking now and take some questions. Stop my screen share here.
My name's Jackie. I'm a CQ Roll Call. I was wondering if there were any voting legislation trends or maybe the directions that certain states are going in that surprised you, because like a lot of these things have been building for years, so you kind of see where they're going, but like has there been anything in recent years where you're like, oh, that came out of nowhere?
Well, it's a good question. So we have been tracking, so our tracker goes back to 2021, but we're tracking legislation for a couple of years before that, but didn't have the tracker ready for prime time yet. So I would say the election interference trend, I didn't see that coming. That was it was pretty unprecedented. We haven't seen that type of legislation in the past that looked to interfere with the actual administration of elections. For the most part, election administrators have been doing their job sort of in the like they haven't gotten a lot of attention for this job. It hasn't been something that's been in the spotlight, and so it was new to have that amount of legislation focused on that. I would also say that mail voting was not a really contentious issue prior to 2021 either. And so we're seeing actually a lot of states pretty much universally expanding access to mail voting. It has been an increasingly popular way to cast a ballot for the past decade or so. And we've been seeing states increasing access to it. We've seen more and more voters casting their ballot by mail. And then, the 2020 election happened. And obviously mail voting played a much larger role in that election than it had in previous elections. And we've seen states really respond differently to that. So I would say that those are two trends that really were different than what we had been seeing prior.
Hi, my name is Minnie Raker. I work at Time. I don't cover this in a lot of depth, so I might miss something or get something wrong here. But back in the fall, I was covering Georgia a little bit, and I remember hearing Republicans kind of talk about this, very high turnout as a way to say like voting laws didn't actually, reduce people who could vote. So I'd love to kind of hear from you about like how we measure the impact of some of these voting restrictions or laws that increase access, intuitively. How do we what's the proof for that? And it also turnout seems like a sort of messy way to prove that because there's other factors that might affect turnout as well. How do we pick that apart?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. Turnout is always complicated because the states are often changing multiple laws at the same time, and there are all sorts of other things that impact turnout. I'll say in response to kind of the Georgia conversation, that a lot of the conversation around that bill that was happening during session was about some pretty egregious provisions that were in the original legislation that got stripped out before it passed. So it was actually a lot of the pieces that were most aimed at reducing access were actually not what ended up in the final version of the bill that passed. So that's, I think, one thing just to keep in mind on that particular example. And also there was obviously a tremendous amount of organizing that happened in Georgia around this past election. I would say that the pieces of the Georgia legislation that did pass, I mean, it is hard to measure those impacts, but what I can point to is, one of the things that the Georgia bill did is it made it possible to challenge voter registrations en masse. So you can challenge basically unlimited numbers of voter registrations, and it doesn't have to be specifically targeted at a specific voter, the challenge. And we saw tons and tons and tons of challenges. This past session, we saw it was very expensive for the state to process all of the challenges. And we had election officials kind of like working around the clock for it. And it was just taking up their time at a time that they really needed to be focused on running an election. And they were instead processing all of these challenges, which were largely frivolous and were all, they were processed and like discarded, but they all needed to be processed. And so that was a very big impact that law had on election infrastructure in Georgia, but it didn't necessarily impact turnout. But there are other measures to see that kind of the negative impact that law had on election administration there.
Hey, I'm James. I'm with Fox, and my question was to kind of go back to what you're talking to of the mail ballot issue. That's probably the thing that's really exploded since the pandemic. But what I've talked to some election administration officials as they tried to implement 2021, 22 is that not only just, there's an expanded cost, there's expanded different ways of how maybe some local administrators would work on others. And I'm not sure if that's something that you've heard or seen by expanding, mail ballot access, and whether it is, if they're able or trying to do it, but maybe the cost or for other reasons, whether it be administration, whether it be mail isn't great in their part of the country, not working. Is that part of sort of their restrictions, or is that kind of just, them saying we just can't do it, or is that sort of just an excuse in terms of gaining access to the ballot?
Is your questions about whether the financial piece is like how that intersects,
and how does that impact in terms of getting out to the mail-in ballots? It's like, should they just be doing either early or mail-in, depending on, some of these administrations, as have very limited budgets and limited time. It takes a lot longer to count the mail-in ballots. I was in Nevada earlier this year, and it took a long time for them to get through all of them. So I'm just wondering, is that part of like the process of what you're going through? Is that something that needs to be worked through so that there is more access to voting, or is it just something? I'm just trying to understand like where that falls in line of the restrictions.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So what I can speak to like what we actually track here, and what we are tracking is the changes to the law. And in 2020, most of the changes that happened in that election were temporary changes. Almost every state in the country changed its procedures in 2020 in order to run a safe election during the pandemic. But those changes were all temporary and like expired. And so what we are seeing is after that, how are states changing their kind of pre-2020 law in response to that election. And so when I'm talking about the states that are expanding access versus restricting access, it's how they change their pre-2020 law in response to what happened in 2020. And so we're seeing a lot of states that for them, what happened in 2020 actually worked really well for them. And so that they are making a lot of those changes permanent and more permanently expanding those access to vote by mail. But then we are seeing other states who are kind of going the opposite direction. So not that they're restricting access from what happened in 2020, but they're restricting access, from their pre-2020 law in terms of mail voting and making it more difficult to vote by mail from the law that predated 2020. And so that's kind of what we're tracking. I mean, the financial piece is always important, right? Like we always, elections need to be fully funded in order to be able to be run well. And that's a critical piece of it. But what we're tracking is actually the changes to the permanent law.
My name is Naomi and I'm with the Washington Examiner. This is maybe a little bit more of a political question, but we heard Trump at CPAC on the weekend sort of say or encourage Republicans to accept mail-in ballot. I mean, he's calling it ballot harvesting, and we have to beat Democrats at their own game. And he's not the only Republican that's kind of realizing that the rhetoric around this was a losing issue for them practically in 2020. I mean, do you foresee some of these laws being tinkered again to make it easier, or will that sort of play out more in a ground game aspect in states that do have, mail-in ballots, etc.?
Yeah, so I will say I try not to get into the head of the state legislators too much and just to track what they do rather than what they're thinking. But yeah, I mean, I think that we're watching that trend. That trend seems to be continuing for right now, that there seems to be a very divisive issue around mail voting. But I will say that most of the changes to mail voting are more around the periphery of it, right? They're making it like easier, or the restrictions of it are like they're making it more difficult to return a mail ballot. They might be more making it more difficult to access a mail ballot, but we haven't seen any states enact legislation that like repeals no excuse mail voting, right? There are a lot of states across the political spectrum that allow everyone to cast a mail ballot. And we have heard a lot of conversations and we've seen a lot of bills introduced that repeal that no excuse requirement and try to reinstate excuses, but we haven't seen any states actually pass that legislation. So there are some aspects of this that do seem rhetorical, and there's a lot of statement legislation that's introduced, but in terms of the changes that are being made, we aren't seeing any of those more drastic measures happen. But we are continuing to see a lot of restrictions on drop boxes moving, for example, and we know that those access to secure drop boxes is a critical component to mail voting. That it's a very popular way to return your mail ballot. So we're seeing that continue. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Like I said, it wasn't an issue that was partisan prior to 2020. So it may return to that state, but hasn't quite yet.
I'm just sort of curious what your biggest concerns are, like looking ahead to 2024, I guess kind of piggybacking off of that.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's so I would say it is concerning to me to see states headed in such different directions when it comes to ballot access, because it means that your zip code determines the level of access that you have. And I think that is problematic. Like that concerns me as a concept. And in terms of, that's like what I'm saying in terms of access. And I think in terms of election interference, there are bills that are really threatening to election administrators. I mentioned earlier that election administrators, for the most part, have been doing a very bureaucratic job out of the spotlight for many years. And these folks, many of them have just decades of experience doing a very technical thing, and are now, getting threats not just from members of the public, but from their own state legislators, where they're being threatened with criminal penalties, in some cases like felony level penalties for making mistakes even, or for conduct that, previously was kind of routine that they used to do. And now they're, not only is it like, did they change the rules, but they made it a felony to do that previous conduct. And as a result, we are seeing a lot of election administrators leaving the job. And that's really concerning to me, because there's a ton of institutional knowledge there. And it's not like a job that you can just hire a brand new person to do and they can learn it right away, right? So it's like, I think at best, we're getting folks who are inexperienced in it, and at worst, we might be getting folks who have a partisan objective in those jobs. And so that is a concern to me, that I would like to see us protecting our election officials so that we can keep them in these jobs.
Thank you, Liz. That was a lot of information, but I'm sure that folks will want to follow up. So we appreciate you sharing all of that with us. Thank you.
Great. And I actually just realized I didn't share the last slide of my presentation, but everyone can feel free to reach out at liz.avore@votingrightslab.org. Always happy to answer questions and just to provide information to inform your stories.
Great. Thank you.